So good morning to viewers in the United States, good evening to viewers in China, and good afternoon in London, where it is London Climate Action Week. Welcome everybody to this exciting and timely discussion. I'm Sam Geall, Executive Director at China Dialogue and Associate Fellow at Chatham House. Today we are discussing the future of the relationship between the two world's largest greenhouse gas emitters. I would like to invite you to please use the Q&A function below to submit questions during this conversation and to use your name and organizational affiliation to identify yourself, please. China and the United States are together responsible for 40% of global greenhouse gas emissions. The 2014 agreement between Barack Obama and Xi Jinping also built much of the diplomatic groundwork for the Paris Agreement the following year. Trump's election, of course, created obvious havoc for this relationship and for US standing on climate change. But the recent election of Joe Biden opens the possibility of new leadership on climate and a new relationship between the world's two largest emitters. As an advisor to Biden's campaign put it in today's New York Times, we have to reestablish American leadership globally on climate change. Biden has committed to rejoin Paris and to hold a climate leaders summit within his first 100 days as president. But on China, he's stopped short of recommitting to an Obama-era style climate change relationship. The US-China relationship has changed a lot in the intervening period, and this has been a bipartisan phenomenon. The State Department Policy Planning Department published a memo yesterday on the elements of the China challenge, noting that, quote, the CCP's resolute conduct and self-professed goals require the United States and other countries to revise assumptions and develop a new strategic doctrine. On Biden's website, his climate plan sets out something he frequently echoed on the campaign trail. Quote, China is far and away the largest emitter of carbon in the world, and through its massive Belt and Road Initiative, Beijing is also annually financing billions of dollars of dirty fossil fuel energy projects across Asia and beyond. Biden will rally a united front of nations to hold China accountable to high environmental standards in its Belt and Road Initiative, so that China can't outsource pollution to other countries. So can a new form of US-China climate cooperation return? How far will the geopolitics of the relationship permit or prevent a return to cooperation? What model of global climate governance we'll be looking at? What's possible, what's not possible, and how can it advance? I couldn't have a better panel here to help us understand the possible answers to these questions. Vance Wagner is the Vice President of Strategic Partnerships at the Energy Foundation China and the former China Counselor to the US Special Envoy for Climate Change at the Department of State. Shuo is Climate and Energy Campaigner at Greenpeace China, where he coordinates Greenpeace's engagement on the UN climate negotiations. Wang is Professor of Law at UCLA School of Law and the former Director of the China Environmental Law and Governance Project at the Natural Resources Defense Council in Beijing. And Bernice Lee is Founding Director of the Hoffmann Center for Sustainable Resource Economy at Chatham House, a member of the UK Climate Change Committee's International Advisory Group, and was formerly Director of Climate Change and Resource Security Initiatives at the World Economic Forum. Again, for those who've joined a tiny bit later, I'd like to remind you to please use the Q&A function below to submit questions during the conversation so that I can sort of move to questions from the floor after our speakers have introduced themselves, and use your name and organization to identify yourself, please. So I'd like to start with Vance. Wagner, you were in the room negotiating much of the work that went into the Obama-Xi climate relationship. But what's changed since then? And what will it mean for climate change and for the US-China relationship for climate change to be central in the new Joe Biden foreign policy?
Thank you, Sam, and hello, everyone. Good morning at 6 a.m. here in California. As Sam mentioned, I had the privilege of serving for the final few years of the Obama administration as the China counselor to the Special Envoy for Climate Change. In that role, I oversaw nearly all aspects of US-China climate engagement, everything from presidential level negotiations and statements to working level sectoral on-the-ground cooperation. I think by most metrics, we were very successful at the time. As Sam mentioned, joint US-China climate leadership not only paved the way for the Paris Agreement, but climate change became what both sides called a pillar of the US-China relationship. But that was 4, 5, 6 years ago, and I would love to just reminisce about what we did in the past, but we're here today to talk about where we are now and where we go from here. So to set the stage for today's discussion, I want to share 2 things which haven't changed over the past 5 or so years and 2 things which have, because any discussion about the future of global climate governance and or US-China engagement needs to be clear-eyed about what these realities are and what they mean. So here's what hasn't changed. Number 1, as Sam mentioned, China and the United States remain the world's 2 largest emitters. We play outsized roles, both in terms of physical emissions, but also influence. There's no global solution to climate change that doesn't involve substantial action by both countries. Number 2, climate change remains a global crisis that requires immediate, ambitious, and long-term action to solve. This was true in 2014 to 2015, but it's even more true in 2020, especially since we now know more about the severity of the impacts of climate change, and we're running out of time faster than we thought. To put these 2 things together, and you get what President Obama said in 2014, that the United States and China have a special responsibility to lead the global fight against climate change. That remains true today, and I would go even farther to say we have a moral imperative considering both our own respective interests and the global good to do so. Now keep that in mind as I turn to 2 things which clearly have changed. Number 1, the credibility of the US federal government as a climate leader has been damaged. Notice that I said US federal government because the story at the subnational and non-state actor level has been very different. Nevertheless, climate priority number 1 of the Biden-Harris administration must be getting the US's own climate house back in order for the obvious reason that we can't return to a global climate leadership position without, well, leading. Number 2, the overall US-China relationship has degraded to its lowest point in decades, with blame on both sides for where we are. But the result, and Sam alluded to this, here in the US is that there is a growing consensus across both the Republican and Democratic parties that the US needs to be tougher on China in areas where our interests and values are not aligned. To be fair, we had major disagreements with the Chinese even during the Obama administration, but in the last few years, it's like the volume knob on confrontation has been turned up, and I worry that it's drowning out voices arguing for a more nuanced, balanced approach on China. So let me wrap it all together. I argued that the US and China have a special responsibility and moral imperative to lead on climate, but also that trust in the relationship is at an all-time low. What this means is that we don't have a choice not to engage, but we have to engage carefully and deliberately and be realistic about what's actually possible. And what we can't do is simply rebuild all of the climate cooperation we had at the end of the Obama administration as if nothing's changed. And in fact, I think most forms of cooperation, meaning joint research, joint pilots, joint technology development, will be very difficult in the near term. But what is possible is dialogue, and lots of it. Dialogues on pathways to carbon neutrality, on respective domestic policy progress, on governance within the FCCC and Paris Agreement, on finance and economic recovery, subnational action, air quality go benefits, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Dialogue across multiple cabinet-level agencies and ministries, across federal, central, and subnational levels. Now, US-China climate dialogue doesn't mean we agree on everything, and it doesn't mean that we aren't vociferously arguing about other things in other channels. But what it does mean is that we're serious about the threat of climate change and the need for the world's 2 largest economies and emitters to find common ground. I'll end by sharing a secret about US-China climate engagement during the Obama administration. Yes, we did a lot of cooperation, but the core approach was dialogue. My boss, Todd Stern, at the time, met with his counterpart, Xie Zhenhua, approximately once per month for 6 years leading up to the Paris Agreement. And let me tell you, they fought and fought and fought and fought. But over time, they understood each other, they trusted each other, and it's on that basis that they were able to forge a consensus to enable the 2 countries to jointly lead. We can do that again, and we have to do that again. Thanks.
Thanks, Vance. I'd like to turn to Li Shuo. We're talking about joint leadership and the prospects for it. At the moment, there's not much question that China is positioning itself as a global leader on climate. And we saw this most notably with Xi Jinping's speech at the UNGA, announcing the 2060 net zero target. How will China be viewing the election of Joe Biden and the prospect of a new relationship on climate change? Are Biden's plans credible for the Chinese leadership? How is his criticism, say, of the Belt and Road Initiative and his suggestion that this would be a central plank of his climate foreign policy likely to be taken?
Yeah, thanks very much, Sam, and thanks to you and China Dialogue for having me. Let me try to tackle the questions that you raised by adopting a similar and very excellent framework that Vance has already provided for us, which is, I think, the starting point should be for us to all look at, what is the same and what is different in this bilateral climate engagement. So perhaps just to reinforce and try to complement what Vance has already just said, in terms of what is the same, I guess what I will say is the challenge is the same. The challenge of climate change is as daunting, if not even more, compared to 5 years ago. The fact that we need all the major powers to be rolling towards the same direction is no less different compared to a few years ago. And also, I would say, similar to 2015, the attention of the leaders of the world is on climate change with the latest election outcome of the US. And I think we should not underestimate that fact as a major asset for us to kind of move forward collectively the global climate agenda. Because now, our issue is indeed front and center when the world leaders meet each other and talk about global affairs. When I look at the things that are different, I think one major thing that Vance has not mentioned is the mission now compared to 5 years ago is different. If you look at in 2015 in the run-up to the Paris Agreement, what we're trying to achieve was essentially two things. One is regime construction, right? We're trying to adopt the Paris Agreement. We're trying to outline a durable post-2020 global framework to tackle climate change. The second mission was for countries to develop their initial climate targets. The task now is different. The task now is to build on from 2015 and to enhance the ambition of all the countries. So in a way, that presents much more difficult challenge to all of the world. And if you look at the US and China here, an interesting dynamic, which is the US accumulated a lot of climate ambition deficit over the past 4 years under the Trump administration. So it is backsliding from its previous commitment, whereas China is on track or even overachieving some of its 2015 commitments. We can have a separate discussion in terms of whether the Chinese or the US offer in the first place was ambitious enough or not. But from a diplomatic and political point of view, there is kind of an interesting asymmetry there in the sense that the US is not delivering its commitment and China is doing more. And I think, what all this means to us, our work, but also the future US-China climate agenda, I guess I'll just say two things. One is I agree with Vance. The Obama-Xi climate honeymoon that we saw 5 years ago will not be easily, replicated. And I think all of us need to be more creative in thinking about alternative models for these two countries to either work together or to at least move towards the same direction. And I also think that the overall tone of this relationship will turn from a cooperative one to a competitive and even occasionally confrontational one. And I think we all need to be prepared with some upcoming harsher rhetorics, potentially from both sides, but also at the same time stay cool-headed and realizing the fundamental has not changed, which is these two countries need to work together, work to move towards the same direction. And very lastly, I just want to kind of point out when we talk about U.S.-China climate engagement or cooperation, we are talking about an issue that is larger than the environment. We are talking about essentially the biggest challenge of our time from a geopolitical point of view, and that challenge is, how do we manage, China's ascendance in the world order, right? And how, as China itself deals with its own rising in the world. And I have to say, I mean, if we cannot find a way to have a constructive engagement between the U.S. and China on the issue as climate change, where the long-term interests of both countries and the rest of the world are aligned, then it will have much detrimental effect to many of the other issues on the global agenda. So I'll just conclude here and turn it back to you. I look very much looking forward to the Q&A. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Li Shuo. That's a great place to bring in Alex Wang on this sort of question of the broader geopolitics of the relationship and to what extent they will permit or prevent a return to cooperation. You mentioned China's ascendance and how that's continuing to sort of strain the mechanics of any potential relationship between the US and China. What can that look like on climate change? What sort of foreign policy on climate can Biden build, and how can it be sufficiently credible and durable that it can achieve what we need it to, Alex?
Great. Well, thanks a lot, Sam, and the folks at China Dialogue for having me, and thanks to the other speakers for your excellent comments so far. I come to this as a person who's worked for many years with civil society on China environment, climate issues, and these days I'm also doing cooperative projects through the University of California, and also in a role as one of the faculty members on the California-China Climate Initiative that is doing sort of academic and government level cooperation with China. So I want to make really 3 points, two of them to just preface the third point, which more directly gets at your question, Sam. So I think from the American perspective, I think we should note how remarkable it is that we are, the major countries are now turning towards a carbon neutrality target, right? This may be less of a new thing for Europe, and certainly, China has already established a target, but that now we have a president who's committed to a mid-century carbon neutrality target is truly remarkable. We don't have everyone on board, but that creates a situation where we, as Li Shuo suggested, we are now in a problem-solving mode in many respects, which is a different place than we were before. Second, I don't need to tell this to this audience, which I think is an environmentally savvy audience, but even though carbon neutrality will not be easy, a lot of things have changed in the energy sector and transportation sector that are making it such that we do have some low-hanging fruits of decarbonization. And I think we need to all get that message out more to the public. Certainly in America, the public conversation of this is really behind, I think, where things are. Not being aware of how energy has changed, how transportation has changed, how building technology has changed. There are areas where it will be still difficult, industrial changes and the like, aviation and the like. But you've seen from the presidential debate in the US where the conversation is, right? Trump's mysterious suggestion that energy efficiency means we all have to have very tiny windows, right? Was the level of conversation we are often having in the US. So to get to your point more specifically about what we want to see from the countries, I think it's incredibly important that China has a 2060 carbon neutrality target. I think it's incredibly important that Biden has a 2050 proposal for carbon neutrality. Another thing I really want to see from both countries is near-term action in the next decade, right? So, and the reason I raise this is I think that will be incredibly important for the momentum that we are thinking that both the U.S. and China can bring to the table. I think it'll be interesting to have a discussion with everyone. To what extent do we actually, is the actual coordination or collaboration the critical part, or is it just critical for the world to see that both countries countries are moving forward in a significant way. And so on the China side, we've seen some details from the Tsinghua research team on how China might approach this. And one of the things in that report that hasn't gotten a lot of attention in the press is that there's a suggestion that deep decarbonization in China doesn't begin happening until 2030, right? So that is a bit troubling if we're going to think about how we need to move very aggressively. So I would love to see if China in the next 5-year plan in the near term starts to implement more specific targets, carbon caps, tougher ramp downs on coal, removals of any policies that will create perverse incentives, right? Early draft rules on the carbon trading market in China suggest some possibility of sort of subsidies for efficient coal, which is not really what we want in a world where we're heading towards carbon neutrality. In the US, we're at a very exciting time, right? We have an administration that's talking about climate change and embedding climate change in areas that are not only environmental, right? Getting the Treasury Department, getting this, the State Department, getting other part, the Department of Defense, other sort of bringing all parts of the government in, potentially creating a national climate council. So all of these things would be very beneficial. It would help to build institutions. To your point of, we've discussed in the past, what is the effect of this sort of oscillation of American politics on global climate politics? Maybe building institutions that are climate oriented will help sustain this through subsequent administrations. Although there's obviously no guarantee of that given American politics these days. But there are a lot of short-term things that Biden will be looking for Biden to do, obviously to get back into the Paris Agreement, convening leaders, the series of executive actions that they can do, getting the EPA back on board with reducing coal, reducing fossil fuels from transportation, these sorts of things. And there's also talk of our Mary Nichols, an official from California, possibly being the EPA head. That would be, I think, a really good, strong signal. On the U.S.-China tensions, as you pointed out in the Biden platform, there is mention that agreement will be contingent on, for example, agreements that China not subsidize coal in the Belt and Road or outbound investment, these types of things. And I imagine those types of discussions will be as tough, if not tougher, than the ones that Vance referenced before. And I think those things will just have to happen, and we'll see how they play out. But I think, again, my view is that the most important thing is to see strong action domestically in each country, sending the signal that these countries, in their own interest, for both the environment, for jobs and economy, are moving forward.
Thanks, Alex. I'd like to move to Bernice, who of course has a lot of experience in sort of building cooperation on climate change with China. But maybe to start with a question about how, in a critical year going to COP26, and with a green recovery and lots of other major environmental negotiations on the agenda, Biden's victory is likely to be viewed from the European Commission, from the UNFCCC, from the COP26 unit, kind of looking at what the possibilities now are and what the place of the US-China relationship might be in thinking about what's now possible that wasn't with Trump in office.
Thank you, Sam, and thanks to everybody, including all my fellow panelists. I think that it is not surprising if I start by saying, clearly, while President Donald Trump may be leaving office soon, the ghost of Trump will continue to linger, whether through his 80+ million followers on Twitter, or in reality, the reality of populism lingering. Now, what that means is that the kind of dynamics that my panelists have described in terms of US-China relations and the sort of geopolitical infiltration into the climate space, as well as the type of competitive dynamics, will likely continue and will afflict not just US-China relations, but also the trilateral relations among US, China, and the EU. Now, what does that really mean? Now, what it means is for us to take a very clear-eyed look, as Vance and others have said, at what really is the state of play. The state of play, I think Alex intimated late at the end just now, is that in terms of the regime that we have right now is really a regime of parallel play. Since we have not a top-down approach, that actually means that what collectively we can do the best together has been, and it will continue to be, how do we invest in the type of transformative levers that actually trigger action and momentum in multiple jurisdictions at the same time. Now, I'm going to throw a few into the mix, and I'm sure that all of you will do the same later on. And those are exactly the kind of thing, I think Debbie Seligson mentioned some of those ground rules in the China Dialogue piece this week on US-China relations. So I would like to incite the ghost of Debbie too, not just Trumpism, which is obviously the type of transformative levers that can accelerate climate action in multiple jurisdictions relate to things that we know and have been talking a lot about, such as, for example, green finance, but green finance at home, but as well as overseas financing that, again, others have mentioned. That's right, and that obviously relate to investment, but also foreign policy dynamics. Now, the third part, as we know, is that in order to have the race at the top, is always a big glib to talk about the race at the top. But nonetheless, it is important to remember that the example we have in the world where race to the top could happen, let's take the old 70s, Japanese top runner approach, which is the favorite example of everybody, because ultimately that's one of the few examples we have about racing to the top in terms of standard. What it really requires is setting high, ambitious standard, clear time frame, transparent rules, but also very clear criteria for achievement. Now, how do we do that and replicate that across the world when it comes to climate action in terms of, that means setting very high standards. And that also means perhaps one of those areas that historically we have been shunning rather than bringing together, and that is around trade. We have to really take a clear-eyed look in terms of how best to harness trade-related rules to deliver the kind of low carbon, low cost options that we know is possible on the one side, but on the other, making sure that more contentious elements, for example, related to border carbon adjustments, are discussed within the context of the need for a level playing field and open rules-bound trading system that actually can also deliver climate action. So my thoughts are indeed that the same type of dynamics that have afflicted US-China relation will likely continue to afflict EU, China, US, but also the COP26 maneuvering space. And that means that if you are in the COP26 Secretariat, you will be, I have no doubt they are, thinking about how do you harness both the competitive as well as the cooperative dynamics in order to create these transformative levers that can trigger momentum in multiple jurisdictions in the way that only transformative levers can. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bernice. Before we go to the floor, there's a couple of things I kind of wanted to put out to the panel. Maybe to start with Vance, that I sort of wanted to go back for a moment to think about the kind of mandate that Biden has and he doesn't, and to refer to what Bernice said. Clearly, the election wasn't a repudiation of Trumpism, and also the Democrats likely don't have the Senate, and assuming they don't, there's a limit to what can be achieved through executive action. And there's also with that a sense that there could be, for the next few presidential terms, a seesawing between Democratic administrations that take on more ambitious climate action and then is rolled back subsequently by Republican administrations. If that were the case, what kind of credibility is President-elect Joe Biden able to create, and what sorts of strategies might be used to overcome that?
Sure. So let me say there are lots of lists being published out there about what Biden-Harris can do in the first 100 days. And even if the Democrats don't have the Senate. And I'm not going to repeat those lists, but I think, there's a lot of intellectual energy going into thinking through how the United States can become a climate leader, even in year one. I want to emphasize two things, which I think sometimes are on the list, sometimes aren't, but particularly in international context, which I think are important. Number one is I think it's critical that the Biden-Harris administration embeds climate expertise and climate leadership throughout the federal government. And so this means not just having strong climate champions at EPA or at the Department of Energy, and even not just having a strong climate champion in the White House, but making sure that we have people with climate expertise and with climate ambition and climate credibility throughout all of the other agencies of federal government, including the Commerce Department, the USTR, education, interior, right? All of the sort of Treasury Department, all of the agencies which are tasked with formulating and implementing US domestic policy, to the extent that they can have climate embedded so that climate becomes an overall mission of the federal government and not just something which is somehow carved out or is seen as all talk or just in one bubble. The reason this is important with China is because one of the reasons that we were successful in the Obama administration is that Obama and John Podesta's climate counselor and later Brian Deese made clear to the Chinese that climate change was a priority across the entire US federal government. And that was evidenced by the fact that every cabinet secretary who traveled to China, and AID, I should have mentioned AID, every cabinet secretary who traveled to China raised climate, regardless of what the dialogue was or what the topic was. And the Chinese were prepared for that, and they had to prepare their ministries and their administrations to speak to that. And that helped to reinforce this message that this isn't a niche subject. Now that was, like I said earlier, that was true 5 years ago. It's even more true today. The second thing that I think the Biden-Harris administration has to do, again, this is sort of beyond those sort of laundry lists that are being published, is coordinate very closely with subnational governments in the United States. Honestly, this was not something we did during the Obama administration, but it was a little bit of an afterthought. I think that embedding bottom-up progress and building on bottom-up progress at the federal government level going forward has to be the strategy, particularly in light of what Shuo said earlier about how the mission is different now, and the mission is no longer establishing the architecture, but it's actually delivering on those commitments. And we're not going to do it without leveraging the experience from California and Washington and New York and every other place in America. And that also goes to demonstrate to China and to the rest of the world that America is serious. The last thing I want to say is that there's been some discussion about what to do about Trump's legacy. And I just want to point out that climate change is not the top issue for Trump's 70 million voters, right? And that's probably a good thing on climate change. And in fact, if you look at surveys of the American public, support for ambitious climate action and even support for more ambitious federal government action on climate is much higher than you might think, given the polarization on some of these other hotter button issues. So I do think that it's unfair to think because America is so polarized and Trump has 70 million diehard supporters that somehow they're going to block climate action, because in fact I think smart climate action, particularly that takes into account jobs and transition and economic growth and air quality and sort of other framings, actually can, there's still a lot of opportunity there.
Bernice, did you want to come in?
I just want to say, I think that the ghost of Trumpism here, most relevant, is of course about China and not just about climate. And therefore it is about how that will shape any potential undertaking. And I think that permeates throughout different policy areas, including climate change.
And Sam, can I add one quick? Yeah, so I really agree with Vance on that last point he made. On there being much greater American support for climate change action than most people realize, and I think that's a good thing. And to give you some specific numbers, there was a Pew poll on this about half a year ago that said 2/3 of Americans think the federal government needs to do more on climate change. 80% of Americans support alternative energy, and this is obviously much more Democratic support, but more than half of Republicans support a variety of policies. And so I think that will matter. Obviously, the U.S. system, because of the Senate, because of the Supreme Court, there are some ways in which that popular support may not translate into policy, but it's worth just emphasizing that point. Yeah,
indeed. Although one of the places where it's likely to be more contentious is alluded to in another question that's come in, which is around the sort of extent to which progress was elusive, has been elusive on the financing of carbon-intensive infrastructure overseas. And I think specifically this is referring to the Belt and Road Initiative and the ways in which the sort of escape valve that's been created for the for overcapacity in China's economy has led to the financing of carbon-intensive infrastructure overseas. And the question is, should eliminating this finance remain a key objective? And if so, have the prospects of success changed over the past 4 years? And I'd add to that, and maybe I'd start by putting this to Lee Shuo, but of course others should come in as well. I'd add to that, you know, how much room is there for Beijing to work on this if Biden makes it such a big part of his pitch? I mean, does that actually help, or does that hinder any attempt by Beijing to rethink its Belt and Road Initiative?
Yeah, thanks, Sam. I think that's a very, very relevant question. Several things that I can say. One is when you look at raising climate ambition in China, but also elsewhere in other countries, I tend to see that that there are two categories of commitments or pledges. One is international climate policy geeks like me tend to focus particularly in this year, the need for all the countries to enhance their nationally determined contributions, their 2030 climate targets. That one in the Chinese context is primarily a political and diplomatic decision, in the sense that China has already overachieved. So whether to ratchet that target up is not sort of a real economy decision. But the second category of pledges is related to transforming the overall economic structure of the country, and that is precisely where the infrastructure build up, China's continuous coal-fired power plant construction comes in. That issue cannot, for example, be solved by the president kind of just making a decision saying from tomorrow on, no coal-fired power plant can be built in China. It does not work in that way. It goes very deep into China's, the way that China's political economic system functions. So as long as you cannot change that, there is no way China can stop or curb its coal addiction. But I think in terms of what is different, now compared to 5 years ago, I would say the good news is there is a better chance now to align China's economic interest to upgrade our economy, to kind of curb the overcapacity in the system, and this climate imperative of banning and gradually phasing out coal-fired power plant. That need is just ever more evident compared to a few years ago. So from a political point of view, and also from an international engagement point of view, there is definitely a better chance for other countries to present that point to the Chinese leader, and that could be potential for some progress.
I entirely take the point that China's leadership is not as sort of smoothly technocratic as we might like to imagine, and that Xi Jinping can't just change all of the kinds of complex drivers that lead to financing going into carbon-intensive infrastructure overseas. But you suggest there are some levers that could change this. Do you want to suggest what one or two of those might be?
Well, I think starting from from our domestic coal-fired power plant construction, it does not make environmental sense. Of course, it does not make climate sense, because it's just going to add more carbon emissions into the atmosphere. But most importantly, it does not make economic sense anymore. And this is the key difference between now and a few years ago. And the reason why those coal-fired power plants will become stranded asset is the country has already managed to get more coal-fired fleet than it needs. So to tackle this problem is entirely in line with the economic interest of this country. And to do that requires deep reform, requires the leadership to touch on some of the entrenched interests in our energy system. And that's indeed, I mean, that goes back to the old topic of reforming and opening up. It is precisely on the reforming part that China has lagged behind over the past few years. So this climate story is actually part of the larger story of lack of reform in the Chinese system, and we need to find ways to tackle that.
Alex?
Yeah, so those are great comments. One other area, so I agree that this is a critical issue, obviously, the outsourcing of fossil fuel facilities. And so I think one other area we can focus on, and this is an area for potential US collaboration with both China and other countries, is to work with the host countries to reduce the demand for these fossils, because there's also a pull from these countries, and also to provide better alternatives, right? Provide the financing that is limited to the green technologies and these types of things. Because it can't only be just complaining about what Chinese SOEs are doing. There has to be an alternative that's provided by others as well. And I think to Lee Shuo's point, there can be a case made to the SOEs and to the Chinese financial institutes that just doesn't make sense to economically to finance these other things. There's lots of risks there, and it's more profitable to get into renewables and these other types of things.
Thanks. We've got a few more questions coming in. Chloe Ferrand from Climate Home News asks what we should expect from a China NDC, and could the level of ambition tell us anything about China's willingness to engage and negotiate with the US on raising ambition? Anyone wants to take a punt? Vance?
Well, I'm sure Lee Shuo will comment on this also, but just make a couple comments on this. Number one, echoing something that Alex said earlier, China's 2060 carbon neutrality pledge is completely transformational and game-changing, both for domestic conversations within China about the transition to a zero carbon economy, but also what it opens up for international climate negotiations. And we've already seen impacts from this with Japan and South Korea making climate neutrality commitments shortly after China. Widely expected that the Biden-Harris administration will make a U.S. Carbon neutrality commitment in the early days of the administration. So I think the focus now in China is, now that President Xi has clearly established this long-term target and has endorsed the long-term direction of China's economy, now the question becomes what does China do in the near term to begin this transition, and whether or not the NDC meets maximum level of ambition, in my view, is less important than the signals that we start to see in the 14th five-year plan and in on-the-ground transformation towards decarbonization, as long as it's directionally going towards the carbon neutrality goal. And with respect to the U.S. negotiations, I want to state that Xi Jinping has long said that China's climate action is for China. China is taking ambitious climate action for China and not for anyone else. And this was true during the negotiations leading up to the Paris Agreement and U.S.-China joint statements. There was never, China brought the level of ambition that it was ready, that it was prepared to do, and it was not a sort of ratcheting back and forth negotiation up of ambition, because China from day one was very clear that the structure of the Paris Agreement is nationally determined contributions, and China is taking this action for itself and is therefore not is not susceptible to the sort of international pressure and shaming that maybe some governments were hoping. And this is principally because at the end of the day, not only is it a domestic transformation that China has to undertake, but China also has to defend the targets that it takes to its domestic audience. And this is, I think, very important. You know, we saw that Xi Jinping made the carbon neutrality announcement unilaterally at the United Nations in late September. I think this is incredibly important and was also actually opens up a lot more opportunity for US-China engagement in 2021 because it takes some of the pressure off. So imagine that Xi Jinping had made that announcement jointly with the Biden administration in February of next year. Then I think he would be susceptible to domestic criticism that China's only taking this ambitious action because of American pressure, and therefore China's domestic policies are being jerked back and forth by the political cycles of the United States. By China taking that action unilaterally, they've been able to confirm this assertion all along that China's climate action is in China's interest, which I think is a strong argument.
Sure.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. I just want to kind of build on and react to what Vance just said, but also try to tackle Chloe's question. So I completely agree with Vance, but I think you know, there are sort of two sides. On one side, it is true that you know, China's you know, conducting climate action for itself, and you know, the motivation is not for you know, anybody else. And I think the implication of that is, in terms of enhancing China's ambition, we need to find better and stronger argument to help China realize that, you know, conducting climate action is perfectly aligned with the economic development of this country. And you know, again, I think the good news is there are more reasons for us to kind of build a better argument and to, you know, and to kind of present that to the Chinese leaders. But on the you know, other side, I also think that the politics, particularly the climate politics of the US and China, are connected. It has always been connected, but you know, sort of been accelerated and cemented by the Obama-Xi you know, climate cooperation. And what I mean by connected climate politics is that, you know, one country's lack of effort will be translated into the political you know, discourse of the other one, and will kind of drag down the climate action you know, across the Pacific. So I think that's something that we need to pay attention to, and that is also why, you know, the recent U.S. election outcome also gives us some worry, because it not only, of course, elected a pro-climate president, but also highlights the fact that, you know, the U.S. is deeply divided when it comes to progressive issues like climate change. So that I think bears long-term implication. Going back to Chloe's question. Again, you know, we understand that there is a strong likelihood that the Chinese NDC will be presented by the end of this year, and I think, you know, what I will pay attention to is whether that updated NDC represents you know, a meaningful difference or a meaningful enhancement compared to the 2015 round, particularly for the near term. You know, I agree with Vance that the 2060 carbon neutrality vision is very, very remarkable. So now the question is whether the near-term ambition will be enhanced to match that, you know, long-term vision. And for us, you know, as Greenpeace, to do that will at least, you know, imply some kind of effort to move the peaking of CO2 emissions much earlier than 2030. We're probably talking about within the next 5-year you know, planning time period between 2021 and 2025. Thanks.
Thank you. There's a question that's come in from Debbie Seligson, and I thought I'd raise it since she's already been invoked, and maybe put it to Bernice to start with. It's in two parts, but I think it's worth reading in full, which is, has the United States learned the lessons of failures from the last two administrations? The 6 long years of relationship building with Todd Stern reflected the shaming approach taken prior to Copenhagen that needed to be rebuilt. I ask because there is language in Biden's policy docs that suggest a return to shaming. So has that lesson been learned? And secondly, what about working with partners, including the European Union? The US has moved away from that in the last 4 years, and we just saw the huge cost of that on the trade front in Asia. Is there a new way to collective action with allies on climate? Maybe Bernice, do you want to start?
Happy to. And is Debbie on a call? If she is, hello, Debbie. We were talking about you earlier and your article, at least. I think that, in fact, I would like to pick up a little bit on where Shuo was, and also going back to the point about Americans supporting climate action, that being an important criteria that Vance and Alex were talking about earlier. I think that there is always, unfortunately, sort of, what is the word that I'm looking for? A separation between the American understanding of the need for domestic action versus how climate diplomacy is connected to that piece. So I just want to reinforce what Shuo just mentioned, which is that I have no doubt that Americans are more supportive of domestic climate action, but whether or not that extends to using climate diplomacy to drive the best possible outcome inside and outside, that to me is a key question. And to me, that is at the heart of Debbie's question too. Because if you think shaming is important, which it could be important in certain circumstances, then in some sense you are focusing on your domestic audience more so than what the collaborative undertaking would be. So I hope that that actually partly addressed what I think Debbie was getting at. And if there is a lesson to be learned, is to recognize the intrinsic connectivity between domestic action and ambition internationally and how they feed back and forth to each other. And why a collaborative approach therefore has to go beyond just what we discussed earlier, but embrace all the different toolkits that we're talking about, and that would include obviously a sort of mixture of collaboration and competition with partners as well as foes as well. Thank you.
Thank you. There's a question from Han Guoyi on the levers of stopping carbon-intensive infrastructure financing in the context of the Belt and Road Initiative. Demands from the BRI countries are obviously the most powerful, which very much depends on the alternatives where US leadership is required, but not clear whether it will materialize. So Alex has started on this, but Han Guoyi says he would appreciate hearing more on the potential role or change of offering alternatives from the United States. I think, in other words, what can the US, the US sort of claim that it can offer something different to a sort of an alternative to the Belt and Road Initiative. Can that really be transformative in terms of sort of moving things on the BRI? Does anyone want to address that? Bernice?
I don't have an answer, but I would like to ask a question. My question is, for all of the challenges and problems associated with some of the directions undertaken with the BRI and related initiatives, what do we really think is an alternative offer? And I ask that question often with all my friends around the world, and I would ask them, what is the alternative offer? And we ask the recipient countries, and we ask also competing countries. And a lot of them goes back to development assistance, debt forgiveness, etc. And I wonder whether or not indeed, as a result, the COVID recovery packaging, including debt recovery, will indeed provide a chance for an actual alternative offer to BRI for the recipient countries can be articulated in a much more holistic and maximalist way.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is an excellent question, and I have to admit, I don't have the silver bullet. But what I would say is it's probably cliche, but I think there is really a need to kind of depoliticize the greening BRI agenda. And what I mean is this issue is a real challenge for us. It is critical to the fulfillment of the Paris Agreement for much of the developing world. So that challenge needs to be treated as a very practical matter. And we need to be in kind of solution-seeking mode as opposed to kind of finger-pointing mode, which has frankly been, where we were for the past few years. And as long as you kind of venture into the solution-seeking mode, you will realize that this is really the most challenging question. in the world. And frankly, if we solve that problem, then the global challenge for decarbonization is solved. So that's why I think that is an excellent question, because nobody has an answer to it. But I do think if this issue is sort of politicized, then at least on the other side of the coin, we need to have a pragmatic conversation in terms of how do we actually help all the recipient countries along the Belt and Road to find better energy security options. And that conversation needs active participation from China, needs active participation from the recipient countries, but also there could be a role for other industrialized countries like the EU and the US.
There's a somewhat related question that came in that I wanted to pose in the last few minutes we have, from Krista Mayer at King's College, who says, he likes the secret that Vance shared, but surely we must be able to do better than just relying on trust to form naturally between two key players. So he's it's a long question. I won't read all of it, but specifically about sort of the sorts of processes that you can use to accelerate and make more systematic the process of mutual understanding. Vance, do you want to add something there? And I think sure. I'll say also, because we've only got a few more minutes, do you want to also sort of give any last remarks, maybe on the question of kind of, what would your, not only sort of responding to this, but what would your kind of key message or key wish for President-elect Biden be, if you were to have a minute with him in the elevator to say, how does he build this?
Sure. So I'll try to be fast. I guess the trust isn't naturally created. So trust is deliberately created through regular engagement and listening. And I'll come back to that in a second. I would say at the most basic level, Americans need to be aware that the narrative, the sort of most toxic narrative within China is that America is only pushing China to take climate action or even to limit overseas investments because it's some sort of strategy of American containment of China, or America's jealousy of China, or America's inability to cope with a rising China. And the climate conversation has to be divorced from that if we're going to have this trust and have this dialogue that's based on mutual interests. My recommendation to President-elect Biden and Vice President-elect Harris would be to listen to the Chinese. At the end of the day, the Chinese behavior is going to be rooted in what China perceives as its own self-interests, and America has no ability to force the Chinese to do something that China does not perceive to be in its own self-interests. So the most fundamental goal, put away your campaign platform, put away that the shaming stuff that Debbie mentioned that's in his plan, and just listen to the Chinese, ask the Chinese to listen to you, respect each other's red lines, and look for common ground based on those mutual interests.
Thank you. There's a great question that's come in the last couple of minutes from Steve Andrews, which is a perfect one for Alex. So I might put it to you and also ask you to put offer any last remarks. It concerns the accuracy and transparency of Chinese environmental and climate data. And do you think there's any opportunity for the US and foreign governments to help improve environmental transparency in China? Is that a particular area that they could work on jointly? And mentions the particular area of concern being the expulsion of American and other foreign journalists from China, including those that reported on those issues. I know you've worked a lot on open environmental information, so I feel like you should have an opportunity to respond.
Yeah. So this is a great question from Steve, and Steve obviously has done some great work to find some major incidents of data falsification. But I think this is a critical area in terms of monitoring emissions, being transparent about exactly what people are doing, making sure that policies announced are not vaporware and are actually doing things on the ground. And I think this is a great area for cooperation because it's one that, I've worked on this issue for many years in China, and it's one that China has certainly rhetorically committed to for more than a decade and a half, and has actually moved forward significantly on environmental transparency. This is not to say that there are not lots of problems that need to be explored, and that's an area, that's a basis, absolutely, that the two sides could cooperate on. You know, on the U.S. side, obviously, during the Trump administration, even in a system where there has been systems in place for better transparency, we've seen lots of strategies to sort of circumvent that and short circuit that. So some thinking about how to limit those types of efforts to undermine transparency even in democratic systems is also important.
Thank you. We're coming up to the hour. Any last thoughts from Li Shuo and Bernice? Would you like to give your advice to either Biden, Xi Jinping, or the people who are going to have to help build this relationship?
I think I'll just say it very quickly, Sam. I think, again, going back to one of my earlier points, the fact that there is muscle memory in both sides at the very top level on the issue of climate change, on the need to take climate action. I think that's our greatest asset. That could potentially make a lot of things possible. And I think we need to think about the diplomatic engagement more creatively, because I can see potential space there, and I do think that people are important. Key decision makers and their preference are important. But also, I just want to highlight that between the U.S. and China, the non-governmental space, the climate NGOs, the climate think tanks, there are a lot of good people to develop relationship and trust there, and those are the things that we need to leverage in the next 4 years.
Thank you, Bernice.
Yeah, if it is the Krista Meyer from King's College that I know, I want to say that he is a behavioral science guru. And the reason why I mentioned that is because one of my first conversations with him involves thinking through the different parts of the elephant when it comes to behavioral science. And I think that is kind of what I would like to build on what Li Shuo just said, which is that we must focus on the big picture and look at, obviously, not just intergovernmental relationship, but also all the different kind of connected tissues, whether it's subnational actors, businesses, NGOs, think tanks, that are all going to be a very big part of framing the next generation of solutions, and also US-China relations that could be supportive of the kind of technology that we haven't got yet, but also the deployment and scaling of solutions that we know we need, but we haven't quite got around to having the system. So with that in mind, I think that be creative about the engagement, bearing in mind that competitive dynamics will change, therefore otherwise a more kumbaya kind of setup. But nonetheless, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't harness both the competitive as well as the collaborative dynamics and find things we can work together on that we could bring to COP26 and COP15, which we haven't mentioned. I think our friends will kill us, our nature friends, that we haven't mentioned that piece, which of course putting nature-based solutions too into a key part of the climate solutions, both for COP26 as well as COP15 as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's a fantastic note for us to end on. And so I just have to thank our wonderful panel and thank you all for watching. Thank you very much.